Hey everyone! Today we're digging into something most history classes skip entirely. The brutal reality of what Byzantine emperors did to their wives behind palace walls. Forget the icons and the golden mosaics. Forget the sanitized textbook version where empresses glide through marble halls in purple silk. The truth is darker, stranger, and infinitely more revealing about how power actually worked in the Eastern Roman Empire. Here's the thing about Byzantine empresses. They weren't just decorative. They held real political weight, crowned, anointed, sometimes co-rulers in everything but name. And that made them dangerous. When an emperor needed a scapegoat, when a coup required a convenient villain, when succession got messy, the empress was right there, close enough to destroy. And the Chronicles? They recorded some of it. But they also erased, softened, and redirected blame in ways that protected the imperial image while leaving these women to vanish into footnotes. We're talking about mutilation, forced veiling, exile to remote monasteries, public humiliation designed to break them psychologically before they even reach the executioner. And here's the kicker. Most of this happened legally. The emperor was the law. If you want to understand how absolute power corrupts absolutely, you watch what it does to the people it claims to love. Now, before we go further, this video discusses historical violence and coercion within imperial marriages, no graphic detail, but we're talking about calculated cruelty as a tool of statecraft. If you're here because you actually want history that doesn't pretend Byzantine politics was just incense and liturgy, hit that subscribe button. You're going to need it. Let's start with the most infamous case, Justinian and Theodora. You know Theodora, former actress, possible sex worker, rose to become one of the most powerful empresses in Byzantine history. Co-ruler with Justinian in everything but title. Saved his throne during the Nika riots when he wanted to flee. A political genius. And yet the sources, especially Procopius in his secret history, paint her as a monster. According to Procopius, writing years after her death and with a very clear axe to grind, Theodora imprisoned women who displeased her, tortured rivals, orchestrated disappearances. Some modern historians treat this as exaggerated slander. Others think there's a kernel of truth wrapped in misogyny. But here's what matters. Justinian didn't stop her. If even half of what Procopius claims is true, Justinian allowed it. And when Theodora died, he mourned her publicly, built monuments to her memory, never remarried. So what does that tell you? Either Procopius invented a villain to smear a regime he hated, or Justinian was perfectly fine with his wife wielding terror as long as it served his throne. Either way, we're not dealing with a love story. We're dealing with a power-sharing arrangement that required cruelty to function. Now imagine you're an empress in Constantinople during the 8th or 9th century. You've been married off for diplomatic reasons. Maybe you're 14. Maybe you're a foreign princess who barely speaks Greek. Your husband is the emperor, God's representative on earth, commander of the Roman legions, head of the church. And one day he decides you're inconvenient. Maybe you didn't produce a son. Maybe your family back home lost a war. Maybe he just wants to marry someone else. What happens to you? You don't get a divorce. Divorce was complicated, required church approval, and reflected badly on the emperor. So instead, you get disappeared. Legally. Cleanly. You're accused of treason, plotting against the emperor usually, or adultery, or witchcraft. The charges don't have to be real. They just have to sound plausible enough that no one asks questions. And then you're gone. Tonsured, head shaved, and sent to a convent on the edge of the empire where you'll spend the rest of your life in a cell, praying for forgiveness for crimes you didn't commit. This wasn't rare. This was standard operating procedure. Let's talk about Empress Eudokia Ingarina, mid-9th century. She's married to Emperor Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty. Powerful, ruthless, a former stable boy who murdered his way to the throne. Eudokia was originally the mistress, possibly the wife, of the previous emperor, Michael III. When Basil killed Michael and seized power, he kept Eudokia, married her, made her empress. Why? Because she was already pregnant, and Basil needed a legitimate heir fast. Now here's the messy part. Nobody knew, or nobody admitted, who the father was. Was it Basil? Was it Michael? The Chronicles dance around this because the legitimacy of the entire Macedonian dynasty depended on the answer. Eudokia knew the truth, and that made her dangerous. She had leverage. She could whisper doubts, plant rumors, destabilize the succession. So Basil kept her close, kept her visible, and made sure she understood that her survival depended on playing along. Did he threaten her? We don't have a letter where Basil says, "Stay quiet or I'll kill you." But we do know that Basil had Michael assassinated in front of witnesses, killed former allies without hesitation, and ruled through fear. Eudokia stayed quiet. She raised Basil's sons, or Michael's sons, depending on who you ask, and when she died, she was honored as a pious empress. But think about what that silence cost. Think about living every day knowing that your husband murdered your former lover, possibly the father of your child, and that you have to smile through state dinners and church services and pretend it never happened. That's not a marriage. That's captivity with a crown. Now let's go darker. Mutilation. In Byzantium, if you wanted to remove someone from the line of succession without killing them, which could cause political backlash or offend the church, you mutilated them. Cut off their nose, cut off their ears, blind them. Because Byzantine law said that a mutilated person couldn't rule, they were ceremonially unfit, imperfect. And this didn't just apply to rival emperors, it applied to empresses too. Empress Irene, yes, that Irene, the one who restored icon veneration and ruled as sole empress at the turn of the 9th century, she blinded her own son, Constantine VI, to secure her power, had his eyes put out in the very room where she'd given birth to him. The Chronicles record this almost clinically. They describe the act, the location, the aftermath. But they don't linger on the screaming, the blood, the psychological horror of a mother ordering her son's mutilation. They frame it as political necessity. Irene needed to neutralize a threat. She did. Move on. But if Irene could do that to her own son, imagine what emperors did to wives they viewed as threats. Empress Zoe Carbonopsina, early 10th century, was imprisoned by her own stepson after her husband, Emperor Leo VI, died. Leo had married her as his fourth wife, which was already controversial. The church barely tolerated it. When Leo died, Zoe had a young son, Constantine VII, who was the heir. But Leo's brother and Zoe's stepson, Alexander, became co-emperor and immediately moved against her, accused her of plotting, had her confined to a convent. Her son was 7 years old. She didn't see him again for years. Did Alexander have evidence? Doesn't matter. He had power. Zoe was erased from public life, her son controlled by regents, and by the time Constantine was old enough to rule on his own, his mother was a broken, half-forgotten figure in a monastery. When he restored her to court later, it was more about rehabilitating his own legitimacy than rescuing his mother. The damage was done. This is how empresses disappeared. Not in dungeons, not in execution yards, in convents, in monasteries, in places where they could live out their lives invisible, forgotten, powerless. And the Chronicles recorded it as piety, as retirement, as a peaceful withdrawal from public life. Except it wasn't peaceful, and it wasn't voluntary, and everyone knew it. Now let's talk about the empresses who fought back, and what happened to them. Empress Euphrosyne, wife of Alexios III Angelos, late 12th century. The empire is crumbling, crusaders are circling, Alexios is weak, indecisive, and Euphrosyne knows it. So she starts making her own alliances, hosting her own meetings, cultivating her own faction at court. The Chronicles, particularly Nicetas Choniates, who was there, describe her as ambitious, manipulative, and ruthlessly pragmatic. She's trying to keep the empire from collapsing while her husband fumbles. And then the Fourth Crusade happens. Constantinople falls in 1204. Alexios flees. And Euphrosyne? She's captured by the Crusaders, paraded through the city, humiliated publicly, and eventually ransomed back to Byzantine custody. But here's the thing. When she gets back, she's not welcomed as a survivor. She's blamed. The Chronicles frame her as part of the reason the empire fell. Too ambitious, too independent, too willing to maneuver without her husband's approval. She's sent to a monastery. Again. Erased. Again. The lesson is clear. An empress who tries to wield power on her own terms will be punished even if she's trying to save the empire. Especially if she's trying to save the empire, because the empire didn't need saving by a woman. It needed saving by men, and if a woman dared to suggest otherwise, she was rewritten as a villain. Here's another example. Empress Martina, wife of Emperor Heraclius. 7th century. Heraclius is a military genius, saved the empire from the Persians, reconquered the True Cross, absolute legend. And Martina is his second wife, also his niece. Yes, you read that right. Canon law technically allowed it, but barely, and people were scandalized. When Heraclius died, Martina tried to rule as regent for her sons. She had political experience. She'd traveled with Heraclius on campaigns. She understood statecraft. The court revolted, not because she was incompetent, because she was a woman, and because her marriage to Heraclius had been controversial from the start. So they accused her of poisoning Heraclius. No evidence, just vibes, and of trying to usurp power. The punishment? They cut out her tongue, literally, sliced it out in public. Then they exiled her, sent her to a monastery. Her sons were mutilated too. One blinded, one had his nose slit. The entire family line erased in an afternoon. And the Chronicles? They frame this as justice, as the righteous punishment of an overreaching woman who forgot her place. Nikephoros, writing later, almost celebrates it. He describes the mutilation in detail, not with horror, but with satisfaction. Because Martina had violated the natural order. She'd tried to rule, and for that, she had to be destroyed. Now think about what that does to every other empress watching. You see Martina's tongue cut out, you see Euphrosyne exiled, you see Zoe locked away, and you learn, stay quiet, smile, don't maneuver. Don't build your own faction. Don't try to protect yourself, because the moment you do, you're the villain, and villains get erased. Tell me in the comments, do you think any empress in Byzantine history actually had real power, or were they all just hostages with crowns? Let's talk about poison. Because if mutilation and exile were the public tools, poison was the private one, and it was always blamed on empresses. Here's how it worked. An emperor dies unexpectedly. Could be natural causes. Medieval life was brutal. Infections killed, stress killed, bad fish killed. But if the timing was inconvenient, if the succession was contested, if someone needed a scapegoat, the rumor started immediately. The empress poisoned him. Doesn't matter if there's evidence. Doesn't matter if she had no motive. The accusation alone was enough to destroy her. Empress Euphrosyne, different Euphrosyne, earlier one, wife of Alexios I Komnenos, was accused of trying to poison her husband when he fell ill during a military campaign. No trial, no investigation, just whispers. Alexios survived and the rumors faded, but the damage was done. Euphrosyne spent the rest of her life under suspicion, her every action scrutinized, her influence curtailed. Because once you're accused of poisoning the emperor, you never fully recover. And here's the brilliant cruelty of it. Poison was considered a woman's weapon, subtle, cowardly, feminine. So even if an empress had no access to poison, no knowledge of herbs, no opportunity, the accusation still stuck. Because it fit the narrative. Women were duplicitous. Women were dangerous in private spaces. Women couldn't be trusted with power because they'd use it to kill. The Chronicles reinforced this constantly. Read Sellos, read Choniates, read any Byzantine historian, and you'll find passages where empresses are described as scheming, whispering, manipulating, always behind the scenes, always in the shadows, and always, always dangerous, not because they commanded armies or controlled tax revenue, but because they might have access to the emperor's food, his wine, his bedchamber. Think about that. The most powerful women in the empire were feared not for what they could do in public, but for what they might do in private. And that fear was weaponized against them constantly. Now let's talk about the empresses who were just straight up murdered, because sometimes exile and mutilation weren't enough. Sometimes the emperor, or his allies, wanted them dead. Empress Theophano, late 10th century. She's the wife of Romanos II. He dies young, possibly poisoned. Rumors swirl, and Theophano is left as regent for her young sons. She's smart, ruthless, holds the regency for 2 years, then marries the general Nikephoros Phocas, who becomes emperor. This is already controversial. A widow remarrying, especially to her husband's general, raises eyebrows. But Theophano makes it work. For a while, then Nikephoros gets too confident, starts sidelining her. Theophano doesn't like that. So she conspires with another general, John Tzimiskes, to have Nikephoros assassinated. They kill him in his bedchamber. Brutal. Bloody. Tzimiskes becomes emperor, marries Theophano, and for a moment it looks like she's won. She's empress again, she's protected. Except Tzimiskes immediately turns on her, exiles her. Why? Because he needed the church's approval to legitimize his coup, and the church demanded it. The patriarch straight up told Tzimiskes, "You can't marry the woman who helped you murder the last emperor. It looks bad." So Tzimiskes throws Theophano to the wolves, sends her to a convent. She dies there, forgotten, while Tzimiskes rules for another decade and gets remembered as a military hero. The Chronicles treat Theophano as a cautionary tale, a woman who overreached, who murdered, who paid the price. But let's be clear, Tzimiskes murdered too. He literally stabbed Nikephoros to death, and he's a hero. Theophano plotted, and she's a monster. See how that works? Now let's go even darker. The empresses who were children when they were married off and what happened to them. Empress Agnes of France. 13 years old when she arrived in Constantinople to marry the co-emperor Alexios II Komnenos. He was also a child, around 11 or 12. This was 1181. The marriage was arranged to solidify an alliance between Byzantium and France. Agnes didn't speak Greek, didn't know the court, was basically a hostage in purple silk. When Alexios was murdered in a coup 2 years later, strangled in his bedchamber by Andronikos Komnenos, who wanted the throne, Agnes was suddenly a widow at 15. And Andronikos? He married her, forced her to marry him. The man who killed her husband became her new husband. She was 15, he was in his 60s. The Chronicles barely flinch at this. They record it as a political marriage, a way for Andronikos to legitimize his rule by keeping the empress in place. They don't talk about the fact that Agnes had no choice, that she was a child, that her husband's murderer was now in her bed. They just move on. Because in Byzantium, empresses were assets, and assets get redeployed. Agnes eventually escaped, sort of. When Andronikos fell in 1185, overthrown and torn apart by a mob in one of the most brutal public executions in Byzantine history, Agnes was freed. She remarried, this time to a minor nobleman, and lived quietly for a few more years, died young. The Chronicles forget her almost immediately. She's a footnote, a child bride who survived 2 coups and 1 forced marriage and got nothing but obscurity for it. Now multiply that by every child empress in Byzantine history. Every girl married off at 12, 13, 14 to emperors in their 40s or 50s. Every princess sent from foreign courts to seal alliances, knowing she'd never see her family again. Every teenage widow forced into a convent because her husband died and she was inconvenient. The Chronicles don't count them. Don't name them. Don't track their fates. They're just the Empress until they're not useful anymore, and then they disappear. And here's the worst part. This was normal. This was expected. Byzantine law allowed girls to marry at 12. Canon law set it at 13. And because empresses were political tools, their age didn't matter. Only their bloodline mattered. Only their ability to produce heirs mattered. And if they failed at that, if they didn't have sons or had daughters instead, or couldn't conceive at all, they were blamed, publicly, viciously. Empress Zoe, the famous one, the one who outlived multiple husbands and ruled in her own right, was vilified for years because she didn't produce a surviving heir. The Chronicles call her barren, cursed, a failure. Never mind that she was married off at 50 to her third husband and was obviously past childbearing age. Never mind that her previous husbands might have been the infertile ones. The blame always landed on the Empress. Always. Let's talk about the Empresses who actually managed to rule, and how even they got punished for it. Empress Irene, we mentioned her earlier, blinded her son. Ruled as sole empress from 797 to 802. First woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own name, not as regent, not as consort, but as emperor. She even took the male title Basileus, not Basilissa. Minted coins with her face, issued laws, commanded armies, well, commanded generals, but still, absolute power, and the Chronicles hate her for it, every single one. They frame her reign as illegitimate, unnatural, a violation of divine order. When she's overthrown in 802 by a coup led by her own finance minister, the chroniclers celebrate. They describe her exile to Lesbos, where she dies less than a year later, as a return to natural order, the empire finally back in male hands. But here's what they don't say. Irene stabilized the empire, ended the iconoclast controversy that had torn Byzantium apart for decades, restored church unity, negotiated peace with the Franks. She wasn't a perfect ruler, nobody was, but she was effective, and she was punished for it anyway, because she was a woman, and women weren't supposed to rule. Even when the Chronicles acknowledge her accomplishments, they do it through gritted teeth. They describe her as manly in her governance, as if being competent required her to somehow transcend her gender. And then they turn around and blame her for being too ambitious, too ruthless, too willing to mutilate her own son. But when male emperors mutilated rivals, brothers, uncles, cousins, that was just politics. When Irene did it, it was monstrous. Same thing with Empress Theodora, not Justinian's wife, the later one, the Empress Regent in the mid-9th century who ended iconoclasm permanently. She ruled as regent for her young son, Michael III, and she did it brilliantly. Restored icon veneration, crushed rebellions, maintained stability during a turbulent period, and the thanks she gets? Michael, once he's old enough, has her exiled, sent to a monastery, erased, because he wanted to rule alone, and his mother was inconvenient. The Chronicles frame this as Michael stepping into his rightful role, becoming a man, taking power from his overbearing mother. They don't frame it as a coup against a competent ruler. They frame it as liberation, and Theodora spends the rest of her life in a convent, praying for a son who betrayed her. This is the pattern. Empresses who rule effectively are punished the moment they're no longer needed, and the Chronicles justify it every single time. Now let's talk about the erasure itself, because the real horror isn't just what emperors did to empresses, it's how the chroniclers made sure we'd never fully know. Byzantine chronicles were written by men, clergy mostly, court functionaries, historians with access to imperial archives but also with very clear biases, and when they wrote about empresses, they wrote through a lens of suspicion. Every action was scrutinized, every decision questioned, and anything that didn't fit the narrative of empresses as either saintly mothers or scheming villains, got left out. We have almost no personal writings from Byzantine empresses, no letters, No diaries, no memoirs. Everything we know about them comes from men writing about them, often decades after they died, often with political motives. So when Procopius writes about Theodora, we're not getting Theodora. We're getting Procopius's version of Theodora, filtered through his hatred of Justinian and his need to smear the regime. When Sellos writes about Zoe, we're not getting Zoe. We're getting Sellos's caricature of an aging empress desperate for relevance, filtered through his need to position himself as the wise advisor who saved the empire from female incompetence. When Choniates writes about Euphrosyne, we're getting his narrative of a woman who overstepped, not the story of a woman trying to hold an empire together while her husband collapsed, and the empresses who were erased entirely, the ones who died in convents, who were exiled to remote islands, who were mutilated and forgotten. We don't even have caricatures of them. We have one-line mentions. The empress was sent to a monastery. The empress died in exile. No names, no details, no follow-up. They vanish. This is the true horror. Not just that Byzantine emperors brutalized their wives, but that the historical record made sure those wives would never be able to tell their own stories. They exist only as objects, as problems to be solved, as political assets to be redeployed or discarded. And the chroniclers made sure we'd see them that way forever. So what do we do with this? How do we read Byzantine history knowing that half the story is missing? First, we stop taking the chronicles at face value. When a chronicler says an empress was scheming, we ask, scheming according to whom? When they say she was ambitious, we ask, ambitious compared to what? When they say she deserved exile, mutilation, or death, we ask, who benefited from that narrative? Second, we look for the gaps. The silences, the moments where a chronicler moves past something too quickly, or uses passive voice, or suddenly gets vague. Those are the moments where something ugly happened, and the chronicler didn't want to dwell on it. Empress sent to a monastery. By whom? Under what conditions? Did she resist? We don't know, because the chronicler didn't want us to know. Third, we remember that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because we don't have letters from empresses doesn't mean they didn't write them. Just because we don't have their side of the story doesn't mean they didn't have one. It means someone decided their story wasn't worth preserving, and that decision was political. Fourth, we recognize that the same structures that brutalized Byzantine empresses are still operating today. The expectation that powerful women must be twice as competent and half as ambitious. The assumption that a woman's sexuality makes her dangerous. The framing of female authority as inherently illegitimate. The erasure of women's voices from the historical record. None of this is ancient history. It's ongoing. Byzantine empresses were mutilated, exiled, poisoned, and erased, not because they were incompetent or wicked, but because they were women in a system that required their subordination to function. And when they resisted, when they tried to rule or protect themselves or simply survive, they were punished. And the chronicles made sure we'd remember them as villains, or not remember them at all. So the next time you see a mosaic of a Byzantine empress, crowned and serene, remember? You're looking at a survivor. You're looking at someone who navigated a system designed to destroy her. And you're looking at someone whose story we'll never fully know, because the people who recorded history made sure of it. If you want more history that doesn't pretend empires were kind to the people they claim to honor, subscribe and check out the other videos on the channel, because this is just one empire. There are a lot more. The Byzantine Empire lasted over 1,000 years. The empresses who held it together, who survived it, who were destroyed by it, they deserve better than footnotes. They deserve to be remembered not as saints or villains, but as human beings trapped in a system that gave them crowns and called it mercy. And maybe, just maybe, we can start remembering them that way now. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.